Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to have such a distinguished audience, and I think this is, if I count right, this is my sixth Zoom meeting to celebrate the 150th. From California, I celebrated with the people in India who were already into the Gandhi holiday, even though it was my evening, Thursday evening. And now we are here on Saturday, and we're still celebrating. So I think he deserves at least 2 days of our time, and I think even more. I also have the uncomfortable sense that the Distinguished High Commissioner has already laid out many of the wonderful contributions of Gandhi, and I think what I can do best is kind of stick to my area of interest and really lay out what I see as a century of connection between the Gandhian movement and the African American civil rights struggle. That might surprise you in the sense that many people believe that began with Martin Luther King and his interest in Gandhi and going to India in 1959. But actually it started many decades before that. And I'd like to just read a letter, and it's from W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a contemporary of Gandhi. They were born roughly about the same time, and has Du Bois, William E.B. Du Bois, in many ways parallels Gandhi's life in the sense that he was a key figure in the development of the African American freedom struggle. He was a founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909. And that organization was the key instrument for many years of the civil rights struggle in the United States. And Du Bois was a person who provided many of the key ideas that still guide that struggle. In February 19th, 1929, he wrote a letter to Gandhi. By that time, Gandhi was already familiar to many African Americans. His exploits were reported in Black newspapers in the United States. So Du Bois wrote this letter, and I'll just read from it. I am the editor of a small magazine, he says, The Crisis. The Crisis was the magazine of the NAACP, which has a circulation of about 30,000 copies going among American Negroes. I very much want a message from you to these 12 million people who are the grandchildren of slaves, who additionally have great difficulties, despite great difficulties, moving forward in America. Can you grant this request? And Gandhi wrote back, and that letter was published in The Crisis. And it was part of that increasing involvement of African Americans, which Du Bois was at the center of, with the anti-colonial struggles going on around the world. Some of you may know that Du Bois was one of the founders of the Pan-African movement. And he worked tirelessly from the beginning of the 20th century to increase connections between African Americans and those struggling against colonialism elsewhere. Probably the next crucial I thought that I had unmuted myself.
Okay.
Now can you
hear you now? We can hear you now.
Okay. Well, I've already given the first 5 minutes of my talk, but I'll just review it very briefly. And
it was just a couple of seconds, Dr. Carson, that you were cut off.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, I was talking about the connections, the century-long connections between the African-American struggle and the civil rights struggle in the United States. Because I think that that's an important background for understanding where we are today. That this is not something that began recently in the 20th century, or even with Martin Luther King's trip to India in 1959, but has been happening for most of the last 100 years. And I read from the letter, I'll just briefly go through that, from Du Bois in 1929 to Gandhi, in which he asked for Gandhi to write a note to African Americans. And Gandhi replied, and that letter was published in the Crisis in February of 1929. And it represented only part of the impact of the Gandhian struggle in India on African Americans. It was widely reported in Black newspapers in the United States. There was a great deal of interest. There was even an ashram in Harlem during the 1920s. But the most crucial event in this connection came in 1936, when a delegation led by Howard Thurman, a Black minister and educator at Howard University, who later actually ministered at a church in San Francisco, led a delegation to India in March of that year to meet with Gandhi. They had a day-long meeting, and they questioned Gandhi, and Gandhi questioned them about the situation of African Americans. And that dialogue, fortunately, was recorded for us. And we can see that those members of the Black delegation from the United States were asking critical questions of Gandhi, how his ideas might apply. Sue Bailey Thurman, the wife of Howard Thurman, a person I later got to know, told me about her question in this dialogue. And that was, what would Gandhi advise African Americans to do about the problem of lynching, about the problems of a white mob coming to lynch somebody in your family, kill them because of their race? And she was not overly satisfied with his answer, but she understood, and he explained how nonviolence, even in that situation, should be the answer. I could go into a lot more detail about this, but I think what I would like to emphasize is that after that 1936 trip, a large number of African Americans went to India to study the Gandhian movement. And they had a tremendous impact on Martin Luther King and the African American civil rights struggle. Among these were Benjamin Mays, who became president of Morehouse College when Martin Luther King was attending Morehouse College. And in his speeches to students at Morehouse, Benjamin Mays would often mention the example of the Gandhian movement. And Martin Luther King attributed those talks to his initial understanding of Gandhi. Another person who was key in this was James Farmer, who became the founder of one of the leading civil rights organizations, the Congress of Racial Equality during the 1940s. Another person in this list would be Bayard Rustin, who also went to India during the 1940s after Gandhi's assassination, came back and became an advisor to Martin Luther King throughout his life, and was actually the organizer of the March on Washington in 1963. So we can see from all of this that these individuals understood the importance of the Gandhian movement. And I'm leaving off perhaps the most important of these individuals, because he's still with us today, and that is James Lawson. I hope all of you are familiar with him. He's still a person who is in the struggle today. He was a person who trained to be a minister. He was also a pacifist. So during the American-Korean War in the early 1950s, he refused to be drafted into the military. And part of his alternative service was to become a missionary in India. So he was there in the early 1950s, came back to the United States, and made contact with Martin Luther King. And from that point on in the 1950s, this is very soon after the Montgomery bus boycott, he and Bayard Rustin are both directly advising Martin Luther King in the aftermath of the Montgomery bus boycott. Bayard Rustin is one of the people who helps organize the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is the organization that King led. So I think I'm reviewing some of this history just to make it clear that Martin Luther King did not come to Gandhi he would not have come to Gandhi without the advice and background of these various leaders. James Lawson also, even more important than his advice to Martin Luther King, he organized a workshop in Nashville, Tennessee during the late 1950s. And he brought together a group of young people in this workshop. And that group included many people whose names might be familiar. John Lewis, the distinguished congressman who recently passed away, was part of that group. C.T. Vivian, another person who died just a month or so ago. And Bernard Lafayette, who is still very much involved in struggles throughout the world. All of these individuals were part of this small workshop, and probably no more than about 15 or 20 people. But of those individuals, they became the leaders of what was called the sit-in movement of the 1960s, the freedom rides of the 1960s. And many of them became lifelong activists. The ones who are still alive are still very much active in the movements of the present. And so I think that this background suggests to me that indirectly or directly, the present generation of activists have an opportunity to learn a great deal from people who are not only influenced by the Gandhian legacy, but I would argue they have transformed that legacy into a global legacy. One of the ways in which I would view the Black Gandhians is that they proved to the world that Gandhi's ideas can apply every place in the world. And they were able to take those ideas and turn them into strategies that have continued to impact the African American struggle, so that even young people who probably think of Gandhi as simply a photo or portrait on the wall understand his ideas through through the people who have developed and carried on his ideas. And the question I guess I would leave you with is that Martin Luther King's last book was, "Where do we go from here?" And I think that in some respects, he is doing what Gandhi was doing during the last years of his life in terms of what will be the legacy of my life. And in this last book, "Where do we go from here?" he asks this question, and he provides us with a metaphor. He says that he compares the situation of humanity to inheriting a world house. And this world house is filled with people of different cultures, different backgrounds, but they all must learn to live together in this world house. And I think that it was a challenge because he said in the title of the book, we have two alternatives, chaos or community. So I feel that our mission and the mission of the Gandhi Peace Council, I hope all of us share this mission, is to try to think of, if you take that metaphor and ask the question, what is the knowledge that young people need to live in the world house? And I think we would understand that it is a global knowledge rather than simply a knowledge of their own societies. It is the knowledge that is enriched by Gandhi's ideas, by Martin Luther King's ideas, by Nelson Mandela's ideas, and as the High Commissioner pointed out, Thich Nhat Hanh, the Dalai Lama, a person I've met, all of these individuals have in various ways told us that Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King are not simply people from the past, but are people whose ideas still live in the present, that they are the inspiration for the movements we see now. And I've been so impressed by the young people, particularly in the United States, but inspiring protests around the world during the last few months. During this difficult period, they are a source of inspiration that the world is going to be a better place. And one way in which I could express their impact is that my life as an activist started in 1963 when I attended the March on Washington. And there were 200,000 people there. And I was very impressed. I grew up in a small town in New Mexico, and I had never seen so many people. That was probably larger than the population of the state at that time. And yet, within days of the murder of George Floyd in the United States, young people, most of them in their teens and 20s, had organized protests vastly larger than the March on Washington and vastly more sustained than simply one day. So I think that we look forward to a future in which these young people, still in their teens, in their 20s, are going to transform the world. And I think that this effort to celebrate the life of Gandhi and all the celebrations that will be going on in January about King's life, I think are going to give new life to their legacies. So I'm very happy to be with you on this occasion, and I look forward to whatever questions people have. Sorry about the technical problem before, but it's still early in the morning here, so excuse me.